now. Hi, folks. We're just given a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in to tonight's webinar before we get started with our event.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah. If you are already logged in with us, you can open up your chat window, say hello, let us know where you're zooming in from. And you can also find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. And if you open up your chat window, you can also find a coupon code good for tonight's featured event book, Tidesong. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Wendy Xu, launching her new book, Tidesong. She'll be talking with Ethan Aldridge, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Wendy, Ethan, and the team at Quill Tree Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in our store spaces, we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection virtually. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat, and you can comment with drawing suggestions when Wendy does her drawing demo later in tonight's event. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. Tonight's featured book, Tidesong, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, where you can purchase Wendy's book and many others on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. For attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. Lastly, Wendy will be stopping by our store to sign copies of the book this week, so you can get a signed or even personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request in order comments at checkout when ordering online by midnight tonight, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Ethan Aldridge, New York Times bestselling illustrator and author. Growing up, his favorite thing to draw were ghosts, monsters, and whatever dinosaur he liked most that week. He now does more or less the same thing for a living. Ethan lives in New York City with his husband, Matthew, and their dog, Kitsu. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Wendy Xu. Wendy is a Brooklyn-based illustrator and comics artist. She is the co-creator of Mooncakes, a young adult fantasy graphic novel published in 2019 from Lion Forge Comics. It has been nominated for Hugo, Ignatz, and Goodreads Choice Awards. Her work has been featured on Catapult, Barnes & Noble sci-fi fantasy blog, Tor.com, among other places. Tidesong is Wendy's debut solo fantasy graphic novel. Perfect for fans of Studio Ghibli and the Tea Dragon Society, this is a magically heartwarming book about self-acceptance and friendship. The Bulletin of the Center for Children's Books praised it, remarking that resplendent hues, big-eyed magical creatures, and vivid setting details enhance this lush graphic novel, and Xu blends elements from Chinese mythology seamlessly with a magical, witchy world. Wendy is going to be talking with Ethan, and then she'll do a drawing demo and talk with all of you. Wendy and Ethan, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Hi, Wendy. I'm so excited to be talking to you about this gorgeous book you've made.
Thanks, Ethan. It's been like so many years in the making, and you've been there for like a bunch of it.
I, of course, for context for those watching, Wendy and I were, and I guess still are, neighbors for many years. We've done several sort of work hangouts while you've worked on this book. Can you go ahead and just give us a quick little overview as to what the story is about?
Sure. Tidesong is about a young witch named Sophie who moves to a seaside town to study magic, to hopefully get her into a prestigious magical academy. And being very impatient and very kind of headstrong, she does not want to do chores the way her auntie starts off her magic training. And instead, she really wants to get into like doing magic immediately. And so she steals her older cousin's spell book and decides to do some magic, but ends up trapping a young water dragon in human form and makes him lose all of his memories of who he was in the process. And then they have to work together to get him back home, but also she realizes that her magic is so much stronger when he's around, and she wants to kind of use him to get into school, but also is conflicted because that's not very nice. So it's about being like a messy kid.
Yes. Yes, I love Sophie's character so much because I have a special fondness for messy characters, especially messy protagonists. And I love Sophie because she feels very much like a lot of kids her age that I know. She's, ambitious but filled with self-doubt. She's caring but also selfish, and I think she's just a really, really well-written character. The book itself is really, really fascinating. It's a mash together of a lot of really interesting influences that I think you can pick out fairly easily. Everything from like classic 80s and 90s manga to they mentioned the intro of the Studio Ghibli films. There's also a lot of like British children's books, I think, like Diana Wynne Jones and Philip Pullman. Classic Chinese mythology, 80s and 90s Chinese sitcoms, the aesthetics of like Maine and New England. Like it's can you talk a little bit about how you went about synthesizing all those different influences and any other influences it might have into the kind of cohesive whole that it is?
Yeah, sure. So I think I always start with like a character, like a sketch of a character whenever I'm trying to draw anything. So for Tidesong, there was the character. It was like this kid in a pinafore with some of those chickens that ended up in the final copy of the book. But it also, I don't know, I was just like, what kind of story do I want to tell? Like, what do I want to say? And what kind of place meant a lot to me as like a kid. I remember growing up, I grew up in Connecticut, and in 5th and 6th grade, we did a field trip called Nature's Classroom, where all of the older kids at the elementary school, I got to do it twice because I transferred schools in 6th grade. So we got to spend a week in like a beach camp, exploring the forest, looking at like things on the beach, picking up kelp, stuff like that, and also like sitting in circles in like the woods at night with a counselor and like making peppermints like glow in the dark with your
amazing.
yeah. So I was like, well, that was really fun. And I love the aesthetic of Maine because I went on like a trip in high school with my parents, and it was just like so aesthetically beautiful, but also like kind of spooky. Maine is a spooky place. New England in general is a very like weird place full of folklore. So
I sort of like big wide open areas, I feel like, where you like it definitely has that vibe of like there could be a weird dragon or a mutant chicken in here, you don't know.
Yeah, and also like Maine, especially the coast of Maine has like thousands of tiny islands, and so this idea of like a witch island kind of came to be. And I was struck by, so I rewatched like all of Journey to the West, this, like, for those who don't know, this 1980s Chinese sitcom, fantasy sitcom based on one of the 4 great Chinese classic novels, and it's hilarious and full of like 80s CGI and like RuPaul's Drag Race makeup.
Yes.
For all of these demon characters. And I was rereading, I was reading Arthur Waley's translation of that novel, which it's originally like poems, very long, elaborate poems that Waley kind of condensed into a prose novel format. And I think he's a really great translator. He definitely captures like so much of the humor of the original story. But the thing that sticks out to me the most about Journey to the West is that the spirit world is so bureaucratic, because the author was definitely clowning all of like the aristocrats and how stuffy and over the top, and how there's like 50 official channels to go through for everything.
Yes.
And so I was like, it would be so funny to make these dragons this sea court, while mystical, very stuffy and bureaucratic.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very common thing, I think, in a lot of East Asian and specifically Chinese myth. The bureaucrat that you're referring to, my personal favorite, I think you can see him right there. This is my favorite character. This is Third Royal Clerk Jai, Coral Horn of the Water Dragon Bay. That's his full title. He uses it almost every time he's on page.
You have to.
You have to.
Title.
And the man just wants a vacation. We're gonna mostly save questions for the end, but just real quick, Delilah in the chat wanted to know if you could shout out the name of the Journey to the West translator.
Sure, I'll put it in the comments. It's Arthur Waley. I can't remember if it's with an H or not, but it's called Monkey. I think it's the first English translation that came about in the 50s. So some of the language is like a little bit dated, but
yeah, I think it's widely considered to be one of the most accurate translations, though, if I remember right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great one. There's something you mentioned at the top of that response that I kind of want to circle back to, which is that the story started with a drawing. So is that common for your process? Does it start more with visuals than with words for you when you're beginning work on a story?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when I'm drawing the setting, I think that's when it starts to feel like a fully realized world. Like for Tidesong, I looked at so many pictures of Maine. I looked at the palettes. I looked at like the brightly kind of primary colored houses in Maine, especially this one town, Bar Harbor, which is so like picturesque and cute, like New England town, Church on the Green, that kind of place.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but yeah, there's like, I don't know, New England is just such a fascinating place. I wanted to capture the beauty, but also like how kind of like spooky it can be, because in the original iteration of Tidesong, the zine, which like Ethan held on to for like all of these years, Auntie was a
Here's
ghost.
the side by side.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole ghost story plot we were talking just before this that didn't end up making it.
Yeah, so I start with a drawing, and I draw like characters. I feel like I'm not an illustrator, like I'm a comics artist, meaning I can't really draw the characters in like static settings. They have to be doing something.
Sure.
There has to be a story, there has to be a setting. Even if I draw like a character and a costume, I'm like, well, what does this costume relate to? Like, I think a lot about world building, especially.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is something I really wanted to dive into, because if anyone follows Wendy's social media, you can find them on Twitter at Angry Girl Comics, or I believe your Instagram is Art of Wendy Xu. Is that right?
Yeah.
You post all along. You're doing it for your current works in progress. You have plenty up for Tidesong of how you do concept art, which is very interesting to me because it's very different than how I do concept art and how a lot of our peers do, I think, which is you do these like style test pages, which are basically, you basically will do a finished comics page of just like a montage of either the character doing like day-to-day chores, making food, interacting with friends, little panels of just snippets of the setting. Now, I want to kind of dig into that a bit. Like, how does that help you visualize the project? How does that help you kind of dig into your characters as you're designing them?
Yeah, I think doing it like a test page helps me not just like experiment with style, but also how does this character fit in their world? How do they interact with like their environment? Place is, I really want my work to always have a sense of place, to feel grounded in like a place and time, even if it's like a fantasy world.
Sure.
So there's like something that happens between the thought and the line that kind of makes me like put, I don't know, there's like a feeling in the line of if it's like a black and white drawing, like, is this going to be a little like more serious in tone? If I'm adding color, what kind of color am I going to add? What kind of palette is this going to have? That sort of thing. So like, especially with Tidesong, I experimented with a number of different color palettes because in an earlier iteration, it was like way more muted colors because I was looking at like whaling scrimshaw.
Oh, sure.
Looking at how those lines were scratched and all those browns and ivories, and thinking maybe I wanted to incorporate like that mood into the story more. It ended up being a lot more bright and colorful, I think, because I feel like when I first wrote it, I had like a 12-year-old audience in mind, but now the audience is maybe more like 8 or 9. There's like a huge difference, right, between an 8-year-old and
yes,
an 8-year-old.
Yeah, in terms of the stories.
Yeah.
Though also, I feel like it functions very well as an all ages story. I feel like a lot of like, I feel like you can definitely see that in holding up again, like even just the covers, where this is a little bit more like sepia, this is a little bit more like pastels. And I think you can kind of see, like you mentioned earlier, like one of the big main towns that was an inspiration for you had those houses that were in those kind of like vivid pastels. And I feel like the book very much kind of reflects that sensibility.
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of springboarding off of that, and like you said, you tested a bunch of line weights and colors. If you could talk a little bit about the sort of journey of the book from a zine that you were offering sort of as a convention exclusives when you're doing Comic-Con circuits, to the full-blown graphic novel that we all can now hold in our hands.
Oh,
what was the journey like there?
It was, so I pitched Tidesong like as we were pitching Mooncakes, and I always wanted to have like not a backup book, but in case this doesn't work out, I want like this other thing that can go out and be pitched. Like my goal was to keep pitching until a book deal came through.
Sure, till something stucks. Stucks.
Yeah, till it's okay. We all have oatmeal brain right now.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's like, so I pitched, so when we were pitching Mooncakes, I was like, okay, so I was encouraged to try a middle grade by a number of different like wonderful publishing aunties, and I was wondering, they were like, oh, you love Studio Ghibli so much, like why don't you do a middle grade? And I was like, okay. So I kept thinking about what kind of middle grade it was going to be, what kind of like age group was it going to be. And I like originally it was about a girl feeding muffins to a dragon. Like that was
Yes.
it. That was just the story. She was going to learn some cooking magic and like feed muffins to dragons and be friends with them that way. And there needed to be more substance. Like my editor, Alex, who's really great. I was working with her kind of on the development of this project. She preempted it, which meant that she wanted like kind of a first dibs. So she wanted a really strong pitch to take to the acquisitions meeting, where for those who are not in publishing, where the publisher would like ostensibly make an offer. And so she was like, well, feeding muffins to dragons is really cute, but like, is there a more deeper emotional like plot line? And so that made me really wonder, like, what kind of emotional thing was I going through when I was a kid? And I feel like even though the protagonist is 12, it's like, as a kid, I always read up. So I was like, well, the protagonist is 12, but the readers are probably going to be younger than that. So what do I want an 8-year-old to know? Like as a 12-year-old, what would I wanted an 8-year-old to know in my infinite, wisdom of being 12? And it was like, man, this is like, it's such a tough age to be 12, especially now. I work with like middle schoolers and high schoolers. It is such a hard age. And everything seems like such a big deal. Especially like when I was 12 in 7th or 8th grade, my parents really wanted me to go to this school and this private school in our hometown, which is also in New England. And if I had gotten a scholarship to that school, like if I had aced their entrance exam, I didn't do so hot on the math part. I think that's what I didn't get in. But I remember being taken on a campus tour of this school and sold a bill of goods about like how great this school was. And being like, yeah, sure, okay. But then I failed the math portion of the exam, and I remember there being like all this disappointment. And I'm like, looking back on it, I'm like, that's really sad. No one should be putting that kind of pressure on their kid.
Yeah, or on themselves. I feel like this is the thing that goes that you wrote really. This is one of the things I like the most about Sophie's arc, is so much of like the conflict comes from like their own like internalized sense of failure.
Yeah, for sure. And I had, because I was such an anxious kid, I think a lot of people, first of all, in publishing, second of all, who are artists, were like very anxious kids. Who,
yes.
Like overachieving.
Also bad at math. That's the curse of curse of artist times.
Yeah, like so that kind of became the core emotional conflict of Tidesong. I was like, okay, so this was like the biggest deal in the world when I was 12. And in hindsight, it's not a big deal, right? Like whatever, Right.
Yeah, this is, like I was saying, this is what I loved so much about, I think one of the biggest strengths for me about the story is how you wrote Sophie and her journey, in that like she is constantly having, from what an adult perspective we would recognize as a panic attack, even if there's not any real trigger. She's just an anxious person. Part of this is like her own internalized sense of anxiety and failure and pressure. Some of it is put on her by her society. Some of her is put on her by her relatives, and it's constantly sort of tripping her up. And you even found these great, very subtle, light touch ways of making those visual. There's like a color change that happens about a third of the way into the book, where her internal dialogue speech bubbles, they shift in color when you can tell she's sort of spiraling. And I love that so much of it is her overcoming, or trying to overcome, or just trying to live with that sort of voice in her head. I think it's really, really well done. I think it is something that a lot of, especially young readers, are going to respond to. Like you were saying, there's a lot of academic pressures, especially now these days. It gets very tricky. That did lead into another question I had for you. In terms of Sophie's anxiety, a lot of how she ends up dealing with that, I don't think this is a spoiler, is that a big theme of Tidesong is the theme of collaboration, of you don't necessarily need to do it your own, that something kind of interesting can kind of come out if you do it with someone. This is obviously your first solo book, but you are no stranger to creative collaboration. You obviously co-authored Mooncakes with Suzanne Walker. You created what I would call sort of a fantastical nonfiction piece with Merlin Sheldrake, who wrote Entangled Life. What was sort of your experience with collaborating on artistic projects, and how did that end up informing the plot of Tidesong?
Yeah, I love working with people. Like I tried writing a novel when I was 13 and I never finished it. But then my first like finished novel was written as a teenager with someone I was very close to. And then subsequently, like I wrote more things with other people I was close to. I wrote this really great vampire, like in New York, these vampires in New York story with one of my friends in high school as well. And like, it's so fun to bounce ideas off the other person. It's like you're making your own little microcosm of a world and you're working within that. Especially when you're working on like a novel or a comic. And you know, when I was working with like Merlin, who's a scientist, I was just happy to get like art direction on like how the fungi should look, because I had never drawn that before. But like that was really cool because this was like, I just love learning about how other people think and how we can kind of like come up with something together. Like it's just like, it's almost like a sacred space to be in with someone when you're working on something together. And I think that's like part of what makes comics really special, you know, when two people work on a comic together. When two people like co-author a novel, it's like one of the most fun things you can do. Especially when you're a kid and there's like no other expectations and you're just writing for the sake of like having fun and like loving something.
Right.
That's like such an important feeling. And that's kind of what I wanted to also put into Tidesong, that like it doesn't have to be for anything. You can just be having fun. You know, and so
yeah, I think like what I was saying about you know, Sophie's sort of internalized sense of pressure. This is a thing I really thought was beautiful about Tidesong, was this idea that you incorporated sort of along with that idea of collaboration, of the fact that despite what Sophie thinks because of what she's been told and what she's been raised to think, there is more than one kind of success and more than one path to get there. And it's not all, you know, be the best at this, be the most visible at this. There's these great kind of different avenues to it. Can you talk about that a little bit, about kind of presenting that? And because I think it maybe and maybe you can correct me on this if I'm reading too much into it, but I feel like it's very, very similar to what a lot of kids, especially kids who are interested in pursuing creative careers, go through, where they sort of have this idea of what success looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you noticed. Thank you for noticing. It's like when I was growing up, and a lot of the kids I grew up with were told that like we had to be the best at what we did. Scholastically, like academically, we just had to be the best. And I feel like even in fantasy stories about schools, the main character is always the best at what they do.
Yes.
Like,
they're always destined to be the archmage or the chosen one or whatever.
Right. Like in Harry Potter, even his like JK Turfling, no love for her, but like Hermione is like the best, you know, at school, and Harry Potter is the chosen one. And I always really loved the Diana Wayne Jones characters when they were just like normal people in a fantasy world. Like Sophie Hatter is, you know, just a tired girl who like, you know, runs a house, or she's kind of mean. She's really mean in the books, and I love that about her. But also like in The Dark Lord of Dirkholm, also by Diana Wayne Jones, it's just about a bunch of like crappy wizard college kids
Yeah.
And like their professor who's like desperately trying to get research funding for his literally like moonshot. He wants to go to the moon.
Yes.
Um,
Sort of weird experiment.
yeah, and like that is so real and so funny. And I really wanted this book to be about a kid who was not the best and who probably would never be the best, but like what does it mean to be the best version of yourself? That's what I really wanted to explore. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but the valedictorian at my high school was kind of a huge jerk. Like
I don't actually remember. I don't know if we actually had a valedictorian. I came from a very very small town high school that wasn't known for its academics. But I think there is a lot of that pressure, right? Like especially now where we have art-centered programs, where I think social media has made people who are successful in the arts more visible, and especially people who are successful like younger and younger and younger. And again, like a very sort of narrow definition of what success means. And I feel like kids can feel a lot of that pressure. And I think that's part of what's going to make Tidesong so important, is that it really digs in deep to that feeling, sort of recognizes it, acknowledges it as a valid feeling, and then presents these great sort of alternatives. Kind of going along with that, and kind of looping back into the sort of design elements of the story, with a lot of big fantasy, especially fantasy dealing with myths like Tidesong is, I think readers are very used to seeing magic be this big splashy thing, you know, rituals and chants and big glyph circles and whatever. The magic in Tidesong is not that. The magic in Tidesong is very tactile. It's very, it's kind of more tied to like craft, and it's a little more like workaday. Can you talk a bit about the process of like designing the magic for Tidesong?
yeah, thank you for asking. That is such a good question. It's so when I was designing the magic for Tidesong, the first thing I was looking at was like yarn craft. I was looking at different kind of yarn games that kids would play, like Cat's Cradle, because I thought like just taking a piece of string and making it into different shapes is very cool, like artistically very cool. So I wanted to incorporate that into the way that they deal with the elements. But also there's the idea that comes from a lot of like East Asian mythology that you can't learn how to do the martial art until you like do a billion chores first for 5 years.
Yes.
Temple, and until you acquire discipline. And so that became that was definitely part of like Auntie's characters. Like she's all about discipline and doing things like very traditionally and very and I think if she had her way, you know, the main character Sophie wouldn't have learned magic for like 3 years.
Yes.
Because she hates showy things. Like I also never really liked things that were big and showy. I think that growing up, I read, you know, a lot of Tamara Pierce, and her Circle of Magic series was all craft-based magics, and I thought that was like so interesting. Like there's like big and small, right? Like in our world, there's like microcosms and macrocosms, and these. I feel like a lot of magic in a lot of kind of epic fantasy books operates on these like big scales, but yes. I'm interested in like the everyday magic. I was just listening, so like here's a metaphor. I was just listening to a talk on like soil and the ecology of the soil, and how there's all these like biogeochemical processes going on in like soil, and that therefore like all over the world that are huge, and we don't really comprehend or understand that. But like when we take a little piece of those processes and put it in like a pickle jar and like ferment some stuff, we can become a little bit closer to that. And I think that's the way I see magic in like a lot of my books, actually, in Mooncakes too, but especially in Tidesong, when you are dealing with something as huge as the ocean. But like, what would it be like to take a piece of the ocean? Like, how would a single person who is you know, a very small being deal with like something as big as the ocean.
Yeah, I love that. I think it makes the fantasy elements a lot more intimate. Like I love that, you know, as opposed to typical fantasy, even the sort of fantasy that I typically write and draw, you sort of have these big pullback moments and it's these huge sort of epic things. And I like that in Tidesong, when people do magic, for the most part, it's close-ups on their hands, on their expressions. It's this very sort of intensely personal act that they're doing. And I think it lends this really nice feeling to it.
Thank you.
I want to see if I can find, there's a lot of great examples of it. There was one, I forgot to pull this up earlier, but when we talked about Sophie's anxiety, but I love that you dedicated an entire splash page to Sophie just fully having a panic attack.
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, relatable.
But there's this great bits with Sage, where like there's an example of sort of a, I don't know if that's in focus at all, but the way the magic works, lots of like braiding the elements, that sort of thing. I think it's really nice. All right, we have time, I think, for one more question before we're going to switch to a bit of a drawing demo. During drawing demo, I'm going to be sort of asking questions to Wendy from the chat. So if you've got questions you would like me to ask Wendy, please put them in the Q&A section. I see a couple in there now. I will be pulling that up in a bit. So you have until the end of this question to start getting them in. Yeah, so I think I wanted to talk a little bit, because we haven't talked about them too terribly much, about the sort of intergenerational aspect of Tidesong, which is, despite how I framed these questions, a huge part of the story. The story begins obviously with Sophie sort of receiving these pressures from her mother and her grandmother, but also their support, because they're supporting her in this big lofty aspiration, bumping up against her auntie, who I believe is biologically her great aunt, her cousin Sage, a person whose relation I don't think is ever specified, but is a friend of auntie's. Can you talk a little bit about the role of family in Tidesong? Because I think there's this push and pull of they're both the originators of some really unhealthy pressures, and also the way those pressures are solved a lot of times.
Yeah, sure. So my intent was for Sage to be the daughter of like someone else in the family. When you're like Asian or when you're Chinese, everyone's a cousin.
Yes.
So yeah, so Sage originally had like a much bigger role, because I think she was the character that like I wish I had when I was a 12-year-old, like a cool older sister type. But we kind of had to edit her back because this was like about, you know, Sophie. But I feel like I didn't intend for family to be such a big player, but it just kind of ended up that way, because I started thinking about how Sophie's anxiety, like a lot of one's anxiety is connected to, a lot of it can stem from your family. And I just like wanted to explore all the different ways in which this anxiety can be exacerbated by your family, even if they mean well. Like especially with Auntie, who is very, traditional, but she's traditional because there's a little bit of her backstory. Like I think this was definitely influenced by a lot of manga I read growing up, where it was serialized, so they always segued into like characters' family backstories of like parents and grandparents and stuff, and how like something came to be. And even in Journey to the West, there's going into the backstories of every single character. So I always feel like, to me, like growing up, it was just kind of natural as well to put in the roles that like the people around you would play in your life. And I feel like, again, a lot of kind of more epic fantasy doesn't do that, because they're so oriented to the main character and like their great destiny or whatever.
Sure.
But I always found, like, for example, in Howl's Moving Castle, you find out that, Sophie wants to be a witch and she takes the place of her sister. Like that was just funny and nice. And you know, Howl is just one person in one dimension and a weird drunk grad student in another dimension. And that was hilarious. And it was like, I think it's part of writing like a kind of slice of life story to shed light onto everyone around you as well, and how you are connected to everyone around you. I mean, so much of the book is about connection, and if there wasn't like a family connection to, like, I feel like that would have been I don't know, almost, it would have just been almost inauthentic to not like go down those roads, because Tidesong was also about how like you're connected to nature, but also about how, you know, you're connected to the nature of like the social nature of who's around you and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think Tidesong does a great job of sort of setting up the classic idea of like the young prodigy, you know, the potential chosen one. And then I feel like you as a writer sort of right off the bat sort of set that up as an inherently lonely kind of idea, very isolating, very anxiety inducing. And Tidesong sort of props up the idea of connectedness as the great good, you know, connectedness to your family, to your friends, to the ecology around you, to the society you live in. Which is someone who is your neighbor, I know is a thing you believe in real life. I have had dinner at your place multiple times in which lots of people in the neighborhood were there.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very common. All right, should we switch to the drawing demo? We have plenty of questions to get through while you sketch.
Totally. You can give me some drawing prompts, and if anyone says Lestat, I know there are people in the chat who are going to tell me to draw Lestat. I will not draw Lestat.
For those who do not know Wendy in personal life, she is obsessive about the Anne Rice works in general and Lestat Lionport in particular. In case I ran out of Tidesong questions, which I had a ton of, I had a rapid fire Anne Rice quiz.
Oh no!
I'll save it for next book launch.
Thank God. Yeah, so I'm gonna sketch, and I can't promise I will take your prompts, but you know, if you have them, shout them out. Otherwise I'm just gonna draw some like cute things.
All right, let me scroll through here. I think at least to start, I'm going to go through these questions chronologically because we got some great ones here.
Awesome.
Oh, we got one request of, can you draw Marshall from Animal Crossing?
Yes, that's a great one.
The DLC's out. Almost every illustrator I know is on it.
I'm gonna draw Marshall from memory.
Do it. All right, and while you're drawing that, I'm going to try and confuse you with some audience questions. All right, first question is from Steen Stewart. Hi, Steens. Other than vampires in New York, what kind of stories are you excited about creating in the future?
That's a great question. Definitely want to do a vampire story at some point.
You have to.
I must. I really want to do a story about like something invisible to the human eye, like Thumbelina, but like maybe even tinier than that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I got, as some people might know, I got really into learning about like fungi in the last year. And yeah, I think the invisible world is just so interesting.
Yeah, this is another thing that comes up a lot in Tidesong and in your work in general, is you have very broad interests, not just comics or fantasy, but you're always going off into, whenever you and I talk, just sort of in our personal lives, it's always some deep dive research that you've gone into for ecology, biology, sociology. It was mycology for a long time, study of like fungus and mushrooms. You strike me as a very curious person and a very curious creative.
Oh, thanks. I try. Yeah, I don't know. I think the world is so fascinating. I think the things that people do that are not art and writing are also like incredibly fascinating. And I love talking to scientists. I got to interview um a pterosaur scientist and like their work earlier this year because I wanted some pointers on how to draw dragons that were based on real life. And I was like, man, this work is so cool. And I could just listen to people talk all day. I attended like a very cool science conference called Zoom Con. It's a zoology conference, and people were presenting their findings about like Neanderthals and stuff.
Oh, that's great. Let's see, I'm gonna start skipping around a little bit so we make sure we get at least one question from everyone who's asked one. Kat Cho asks, what other medium would you love to see your work in? So assuming either working in other mediums yourselves or adaptations, like we're talking movies, we're talking animation, we're talking video games, prose.
Also, hi Kat, thanks for coming. I was just on a call with Kat and Clarabelle earlier tonight. I would love to eventually make a game, a farm sim. I have aspirations of making a farm sim.
That would be great.
Like Animal Crossing.
Would you adapt a farming sim directly from Tidesong, or would you create a bespoke world for it?
I would definitely create a world like for a farm sim specifically. I've been playing Cozy Grove, which is a supernatural camping farm sim, as well as games like A Short Hike and Haven Park.
I love those.
Yes, they're so cute. There are so many fun things you can do in games that you can't do in comics. Mostly, like I just like that in Haven Park. You push B and the little bird just says pew.
Amazing. Yeah, I recently A Short Hike was like my comfort game during the pandemic lockdowns here in New York City. I would just play it on loop. Yeah, I kind of see what you're talking about. Kind of video games kind of give you the opportunity to explore every little background character's whole thing and really kind of plug into the setting.
Yeah.
I love these. You draw these so quickly. And now, you're not really sketching for the most part here. You're just kind of going straight to line here.
Kind of. I usually start with the blue pencil. That like I consider that my sketch stage.
Now, are you drawing on an iPad? Is that what this is?
Yeah.
Lovely. All right. Next question. Shavana asks. Hi, Shavana. When designing your characters, in what ways do you visually demonstrate their personalities and lifestyles without putting it in your written dialogue?
Oh, that's a really good question.
This is something I feel like you are specifically very good at.
Thank you. That means a lot to me as someone who tries very hard to do that. I try to think about their mannerisms and the ways in which like when I was designing Sophie, it was all about like how would a 12-year-old's body language be, or how would me as a 12-year-old. I definitely hunched a lot. She crosses her arms a lot. She does this thing with her hand, like she does like little T-Rex hands sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I've definitely done when I was nervous. Just stuff like that. If I'm designing a character who is quite bold, I might give them like bigger features, like big eyebrows or like an angry expression. But with Auntie, her main feature is that she's a very scowly lady. So I made sure to, and she's scowly and old, so she's wearing like loose clothes and she likes to be comfortable.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was so I think about their clothes a lot. For Tidesong, the aesthetic was like loosely based on kind of modernizations of hanfu, like the traditional Chinese dress, yukata, and stuff like that I really liked. Like a lot of contemporary East Asian streetwear have taken these kind of ancient designs and modernized it, and I thought that was so cool. So that was definitely part of the choices in Tidesong.
Yeah, I think it conveys their personalities really well, and then like along with the costume that you were just talking about, conveys a lot of sort of like cultural world building without you having to really go into any like big long histories of the city or whatever. You can kind of get the feel of what sort of place this is just based on the clothes and the architecture and how the city is laid out, things like that.
Yeah. I don't think people realize this, but like, and I know you make such like beautiful backgrounds in your fairy worlds.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Like, I don't think people realize how much work the artist has to do in terms of, architecture, styling, like world building, stuff like that. But yeah, like I definitely looked at a lot of, New England architecture, but also like the shapes of, Chinese houses and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's something that almost always surprises, especially when you do something like comics where it's such a long form visual medium. I would imagine animation is a similar way in that like you sort of have to become at least conversant in a lot of different fields, like not only illustration, but also things like cinematography, architecture, fashion design, city planning. I remember for one of my books, I spent something like a week trying to figure out if underground buildings would have roofs and what underground civilizations did about that.
Yeah, like all of these things that I feel like, no offense, but that prose authors might take a little bit for granted. We always have to think about if we want to make the book look good.
Yes, yeah. I as someone who's sort of dipped my toe into both, it's for one question you can be like, oh, they're Steens is throwing shade in the in the chat here. She says full offense to prose authors. As someone who is sort of dipped my toe into both, it's been fun with prose to be like, oh, he wore a dark outfit, and I can sort of just leave it there. Whereas with comics, I'm like, well, what era is he from? What's the cut of his clothes? What is time period accurate?
Right.
It's very complicated. Moving on to the next question. Antoine asks, when pitching, do you include layouts too, or are your pitches usually just synopsis and some of the script? How visual are your pitches?
You absolutely must include as much of the you have to make the editor and you have to make the acquiring editor be able to visualize the finished book as best they can, which means giving them as much material as possible to work with so that they can have a sense that like you can draw, first of all, and to give them a sense of what finished art and pages will look like. So yeah, you have to include at least like 15 finished pages.
Did you use the original zine you had as part of the pitch?
I did.
So let's see. I have that right here. That's a good stack of pages. You've got a map in there.
Yeah, I even include my concept art when I'm pitching. Selectively, I make a lot of concept art.
Do you save all those files, or is that on your computer somewhere?
It is. I have everything organized into like development art and actual comics chapters.
Lovely. There's another question that I think I can just answer real quick. Delilah asks, when this Q&A is over, will it be on YouTube? Yes, it is. I'm not sure it will be up immediately. It will be up at some point over the next couple days on Greenlight Bookstore's YouTube page, I believe. Let's see, we're getting down to the last 5 minutes here. We have a few more questions. Steens asks, so many of your comics have magic in them. Do you think you'll always create stories with magic, either fantasy magic, sci-fi magic, magic of real life, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, because otherwise, to me, It's just like a little bit boring there are so many people who can do like amazing contemporary work. So many artists, both like American and Japanese, who do just such amazing contemporary work. But for me, those stories, like for me, drawing that would be too boring. I love reading them, but I always love to incorporate some kind of fantasy into my work.
And we can talk about it a little bit more as we wrap up, but your next announced project is a sci-fi sort of space opera romance, right?
Yes, it's called The Infinity Particle. It is a love story between a girl and a robot. And I have done I've been doing extensive development art for it as I've been sketching, as I've been doing the pencils. And yeah, The Infinity Particle had me researching everything from mycology. There's definitely mycology tie-in. If you see it, if you know, when in the panels and stuff, but also different elements of bioengineering design. There's this really great Netflix documentary. There's this really great Netflix design series that Shavana made me watch. Thank you. But one of the episodes was about Neri Oxman. She's an Israeli scientist, and in her lab at MIT, she works with engineering shrimp shells and all of the molecular structures found in things like shrimp shells and spider silk into sustainable building design or building materials, which is so cool. And a lot of the designs end up having kind of more biological rounded shapes instead of the architecture that we think of as modern or even science fiction. I feel like a lot of sci-fi architecture is very angular.
Yes.
So I really wanted to incorporate kind of a more round,
kind of more of organic
approach into that. Yeah.
Delilah actually just asked what sci-fi works inspired this new one, and I feel like you kind of went into that.
Yeah.
I guess more like actual science went into it.
Actual science and I've always loved robots and robot stories.
Yeah, and I feel like is this right where if people wanted to go kind of get once you're done binge reading the wonderful Tidesong, I think they can go on your social media and see some sneak peeks of the Infinity Particle, right?
Yes.
They are up there.
They are.
Okay. We are in the last couple minutes here as way of sort of a quick wrap up. Again, this event is hosted by the wonderful Greenlight bookstore here in Brooklyn. If you would like copies of Tidesong, you can order it directly from their website or pick it up at either of their locations. Wendy is going to be going and signing their stock tomorrow. Look, I see the details have just popped up in the chat. So if you want more than just my talking quickly about it, it's more concrete. You can, if you order online for this event, you can get 10% off by using the code GreenlightEvents10. And if you put in the comments of your order online by tonight, you can get a signed and personalized copy from Wendy. And then there will be signed copies in there. I believe I have it in my notes here. To make sure I have the right location. The Flatbush location is where you'll be signing, which is the one that is you're sort of in the neighborhood of.
Yes. But also people should pick up Ethan's books too. They're beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, plug yourself.
Yes, I also have books, which you can also get at Greenlight. They are also there. They're lovely. Okay, that's about time. I don't know if Chelsea at Greenlight has anything that they want to add, but Wendy, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Chelsea, for doing all the tech stuff.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy and Ethan, for this fantastic conversation. And thank all of you for coming out tonight and sharing this space with us. Like Ethan said, you can buy the book from Greenlight. You can stop by either our Flatbush or Fulton Street stores and Those signed copies will be at Flatbush sometime after tomorrow. And you can also find the link in the chat to buy online from greenlightbookstore.com for either local in-store shipping or local in-store shipping does not make sense. Local in-store pickup or shipping anywhere in the US. And you can also find Ethan's books online at greenlightbookstore.com or in either of our stores. And the recording of tonight's event will be up on our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore, within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out there. Thank you all again so much and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.